Well, good afternoon, everybody, or good morning, depending where you're calling in from. My name is Mark Podlasly. My ancestral name is Tatsha, and I'm calling into you today from Coast Salish territory out in the Pacific Northwest near Vancouver, Canada. And I am the Chief Sustainability Officer at the First Nations Major Projects Coalition. And we are very pleased to present to you today this conversation about defining our sustainable future. We're going to be talking about the coalition's conference, most specifically the one that happened last April, but looking forward to what's next. So I'm very pleased to be joined today by Kate Finn and Jaimie Lickers, who have been co-hosts of the conference at different times over the past 2 years and have been will be at our next conference as well, which will be in April next year in Toronto, April 22nd, 23rd. So I'll just let each of them introduce themselves. Kate, can I start with you, please?
Yes, thank you so much for hosting this today, Mark. It's good to see you on the screen, and Jaimie, good to see you too. My name is Kate Finn. I am a member of the Osage Nation, and I am the Executive Director of First Peoples Worldwide, which is a program out of the University of Colorado at Boulder. And our mission is to work from a foundation of Indigenous values to achieve a sustainable future for all. So I'm just so glad to be in this conversation to continue the dialogue on what a values-driven economy looks like for Indigenous peoples.
Perfect. Great to see you again, Mark. Great to see you, Kate. I'm Jaimie Lickers. I'm the Senior Vice President of the Indigenous Markets team over at CIBC. So I come to these discussions from the finance point of view. Really looking forward to joining in the conversation today, reliving a bit of our successes from this year's event and looking forward to talking about the wonderful event that we'll have, of course, next spring.
Well, thank you to both of you. What was great about the conference is that it was a chance for people like us to meet others very interested in the same topic, not only from across Canada and the United States, Turtle Island, but from around the world. For those of you who were not at the conference last year, our focus last year was on Indigenous values and the importance of Indigenous values to commercial success. And at the conference, we had over 1,500 attendees come. About 1/3 Indigenous, like as I said, from across Turtle Island around the world, corporate and government. What was fascinating to me about that conference was just seeing the enthusiasm and the energy that people brought to that topic. And before I go on to the specifics who was there, is there anything either of you'd like to make comments about what you found at that conference of 1,500 people in Vancouver last April?
I'm happy to jump in first there, Mark. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Jaimie.
It's funny when you say that about 1,500 attendees. That brings a bit of a smile to my face because, I'll never forget that moment when Ali first told us that the event had hit 1,500 registrations. And just to think of how quickly the profile and the reputation of the FNMPC has grown, and rightly so, demonstrates that not only was there clearly a void in our national landscape and our national discussions as far as a forum to talk about Indigenous participation in major projects. And that's not to say that these discussions haven't been happening in communities and boardrooms and government offices for years, but there was no national forum, no national stage to engage on these issues. And that's really the success of the FNMPC. And I'd just like to take a moment to congratulate you and the team on that wonderful growth and accomplishment.
Well, thank you. This was our 6th annual conference. And what was interesting about this conference is watching how the interest has grown year by year. As we pointed out at the conference last time, our first conference 6 years ago had approximately 50 individuals. And we met in a small town in northern British Columbia in Canada. And it was a very important event. And what we found going forward now is that this entire change, the need for Indigenous values, consent to be built into projects is becoming very much mainstream, not just for Indigenous people, but for companies and governments. So it was great to have you as a co-host, Jaimie. And I remember when we were on stage, you're right, when the 1,500 person target had been met, the announcement, even the audience was pleased. So it was a great to see that from an Indigenous perspective, to see that our values and our environmental and commercial input into these projects is not only valued, but it's required. So Kate, was there anything that struck you in the conference? You were your co-host the previous year. This year, you had a chance to observe. How was that?
It was fascinating. It was fascinating to watch, and I'll echo what Jaimie said. And congratulations on the huge growth of the conference. And one of the things I look forward to every year about this conference, that I'm looking forward to again, is that it really is a demonstration of the Indigenous economy. It's a demonstration of values. It's a demonstration of expertise, and we get to have very nuanced conversations together with Indigenous peoples from all over North America and from all over the world, and with the private sector. And so the level of nuance is just really good and crunchy and fun to be a part of, and just so demonstrative of Indigenous expertise. And I think it's a real pointer to the market about what needs to be understood as data and what needs to be understood as important in terms of business partnership. And I'll just say, it was really fun to watch. It was fun to see all of the gears clicking. It was fun to see how much listening and deep listening was going on. And I had the honor of moderating the youth panel and having 4 youth from North America up there to talk about their experience and their work in their local economic endeavors and in their degree programs. And that was so fun. It was so fun to sit with them and to gather that energy and to gather that perspective. But what was really fun was to be on stage and to see the entire room listening with rapt attention and really understanding that this is where we want our attention put. We want to support our next generations, and this is such a value for Indigenous peoples, leading in and leaning into what youth have to say and where they're going. So that was just an honor, and I really look forward to seeing those folks again next year.
Thank you, Kate. That youth panel was amazing. 2 youth from Canada, 2 youth from the United States, both Indigenous, and sharing very much where they saw the future and where they saw Indigenous values, but also where the youth was going in terms of climate change, environmental impacts, economic inclusion. It was mesmerizing. We will be doing another session like that at this conference coming up in April next year, another youth panel, again, profiling youth, Indigenous youth from around the world. So let's just dive into some of the pieces that we went into at the conference. Jaimie, from the capital markets perspectives, I know that was a discussion that you had on stage. You interviewed Bill Morneau on stage, former finance minister of Canada. And given your perspective of your role career-wise, since April, has anything shifted in capital markets vis-a-vis Indigenous people going forward?
Well, maybe, but before I get to that very important question, Mark, just a comment about my fireside chat with Mr. Morneau, which, Kate was talking about the amazing youth panel that she was involved in, and for me, the discussion with Bill Morneau was probably the highlight. Second, of course, to co-hosting with you, Mark, over the entire length of the event. But one of my favorite parts of my involvement in the event in April, and I think a really important discussion that needed to be had about the direction of government policy and certain other developments in the financing and capital market space. And I got a few of my little quips in there too, in our discussion with Bill, and I'm not sure that he appreciated all of them, but the audience found it somewhat entertaining. And the other thing I will say is that, you ask what's changed from a capital markets perspective, and I don't know, interest rates come to mind. It's no surprise to most of the folks that are here with us listening today that obviously we're in a rising rate environment and have been for the last year or so. But the good news is that the Bank of Canada held steady on the interest rate at its October 25th meeting instead of further increasing rates in an effort to combat inflation. We expect to be in what I call the heightened rate environment for at least the short to medium term. Interest rates, yes, go up and down, and that's part of the economic cycle. But we do expect that they will hold around the current rates for at least the short term. And of course, when they do come down, they may not come down as rapidly as they went up. And of course, this means that capital is more expensive. It's more expensive for all of the players in the economy. It doesn't help Indigenous communities that are looking for capital to participate in major projects. And in my view, further underscores the need for access to affordable and reliable capital, preferably through the form of a federal loan guarantee program for First Nations. But those are just my thoughts.
So I just want to point out, yes, Jaimie, Kate, and I, when we were planning these questions for the conference and planning out the agenda, we had a lot of fun. And you can tell already the humor and teasing each other. That was going on stage, obviously going on this stage too. Jaimie, you were right. The discussion that you had with Bill was fascinating. And you're right now about the whole interest rate question changing things going forward. There are stories in today's press rumored that there is a federal loan guarantee possibly coming from Ottawa. It'd be interesting to see if that is going to be on the books. Indigenous people have as our greatest barrier to involvement in these projects is access to affordably priced capital. For those of you who may be from outside Canada, Canada has a loan guarantee, provinces, regions in the country have loan guarantee programs for Indigenous people to access capital. Federally, we do not have one, but the coalition has 145 member nations across the country, almost all of which have a project that they want to get involved in, but we can't access capital because of the historical setup between us and the federal government. In those discussions, when you were having on stage with Mr. Monod, the same thing, you could watch people being rapt in their attention to see what he would have to say about policy and changes that could be coming. We will be having more conversations like that on stage this year. And I just want to point out in terms of capital markets, or at least the financial sector, we are sponsored by the Royal Bank of Canada this year as our principal sponsor. And I will let it out now. It'll be announced later this week. One of our keynote speakers will be the CEO of the Bank of America, who will be coming to speak about their perspective on questions related to an initiative that they're doing called the Smart Markets Initiative. So with that, Kate, I want to come back to you for a question. At the conference last year, we did quite a bit of discussions around the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, and how that is affecting Indigenous people there, tribal access in terms of tax credits and other options available. At the time, that was fairly new. We had a number of speakers from the U.S. government, also U.S. tribal representatives as well. Has anything changed in relation to the IRA and tribes in the United States?
Yeah, so it's to be quick here. It's been a year. It's been a year and a half since it's passed, and so we've really had this opportunity to watch what's going on, and really what the IRA represented was this ability for cash to flow to Indian country and for there to be incredible incentives. And also included in the IRA was some provisions that really assist tribes to stack capital and to use tax incentives in a different way. And so that really kind of opened a lot of floodgates and allowed tribes a level of creativity and allowed honestly investors and others to really look at tribes in a different way to understand how they could build projects. And where we are today, I would say, is not uniform. There's a lot of different tribes who are doing different things and different deals being made. But what I would say is one of the outcomes of this is showing where there are infrastructure gaps in terms of delivering capital to Indian country. And these are not gaps that anyone didn't know existed. We know that these exist, but for example, there's still, even if tribes can get cash for renewable energy projects, there's still issues connecting to regulatory structures, to connect with the grid, to connect with regional grids and regional systems as well. And that's, of course, an expensive process and a technical process that can take years and years and years to develop. So I think, there really has been some amount of challenge that tribes have forecasted back or have telegraphed back in terms of developing the infrastructure around those projects, the regulatory hurdles and technical hurdles and time hurdles. So time will tell in terms of the long-term effects of this, but I think it's really opened a lot of the creativity and thinking, and it's opened a lot of opportunity for partnership and a lot of opportunity for good engagement around what new capital can be like. So I think, and harkening back to the report that came out of the last conference, a lot of the infrastructure challenges in Canada are very similar for tribes in the US, and those are really being exposed, but they're also being worked on. So reports from tribes really show that where there are some really new and good deals being done to receive capital, to build new infrastructure, and to build good partnerships, that's being done around renewable energy projects. And so that's a really good place to see a lot of the energy and creativity come to after the IRA.
Thank you, Kate. I just want to highlight again, this is Turtle Island, Canada, United States. We are one people in the Indigenous world. So we look to examples across Turtle Island. So the examples here that you've heard from Kate in terms of what's happening in the IRA for credit stacking, tax credit stacking, and other opportunities in renewable energy, we look to that from Indigenous nations in Canada and think, okay, what can we learn? And we hope that nations in the United States can look to what we're doing and try and take those lessons as well. I mentioned the loan guarantees that are happening in Canada. There are programs in three provinces, Ontario, Saskatchewan, and Alberta, who are helping Indigenous people access capital. The other example learned at this conference and this conference included the Navajo Nation, Navajo Power, which is just amazing in what they're doing in terms of spreading renewable energy opportunities, not just for others as well. And hopefully, we do know that, other nations we looked at last year, or this year at the conference, from Australia. There was an example at the conference of a 62 gigawatt green hydrogen production facility that was initiated by the Mirning First Nation in Western Australia. And when complete, will be a $1 billion Australian, that will be exporter green hydrogen to Japan, and it will be First Nations initiated, and they still retain an equity ownership in it in partnership with Macquarie's, CWP, and BP. So those are the examples that we look to as inspirations as Indigenous people across Turtle Island to say, hey, we have an important role to play in not only the energy transition, but helping the economies and at the same time helping our own people and communities with opportunities. Going forward to the conference next year, we will have examples from around the world again. And if you our website, fnmpc.ca/conference, or at the upper left of the main website, you'll find a conference reference. The conference itself will be on April 22nd and 23rd in Toronto, and we look forward to seeing you there. Other things that I want to raise here about what we're looking forward in the conference is the program itself I mentioned is Our Competitive Advantage, Indigenous Consent. What we're going to do is focus on four main themes. One will be on policy initiatives that are required to make that happen. One on mining, be specifically on critical minerals, which are essential to the clean energy transition. And given that clean energy transition requires metals and clean energy that's going to come from Indigenous lands, it's vital that consent be sought from Indigenous people. We'll also do one on energy, which we've just touched on in terms of how that's going to be part of the future. And the next one will be on finance. The financing question, again, is the #1 topic for our nations in the coalition in Canada about trying to get these projects off the ground. So as we go forward, we invite you to come. I'd also invite you right now, as on the side, questions are coming in. And if you have questions for myself or our panelists about the conference that has happened or the conference that is coming, we'll be happy to answer those. I do want to recognize that someone here from Texas has written in, which is amazing. So welcome. So as
I
we're
will
going to
just
go
say
forward,
maybe,
yeah, go ahead.
Mark, maybe I could just jump in for a moment on that. You mentioned briefly the article that was in the Globe and Mail this morning. For those that are joining us from outside of Canada, that's one of our major news publications. And I would encourage all of the attendees to take a look at that article that was published today in the Globe, because it gives a really good overview, a really good outline of where the issues of access to capital, where they come from, and the foundations of those issues. And Mark alluded to the Indian Act and to those limitations that are within our federal legislation in Canada. Being a recovering lawyer turned banker myself, no one understands the implications of those legislative limitations better than I do. And the article in the Globe today really gets into the issue of why is a federal government loan guarantee program required to facilitate participation of Indigenous communities in major projects. And I think it's a really good foundational piece for those that might be new to the discussion. But it's a really important piece for the continued participation and the increased participation of Indigenous communities in the economy in Canada in a way that is just more just and more equitable. And that arguably we shouldn't even need to have this conversation, but here we are year after year on a national stage and at the FNMPC event talking about the importance of access to reliable and affordable capital. And we're going to keep having this discussion until, it's where the money is, right, Kate? We've got to find a way to get the money where it needs to be.
Here.
Thank you.
It's just so much. Yes. And what I can say is in the US, it's such a similar regime, right? And something that is true around the world too. It's a similar barriers, similar political and legal barriers that create so many hurdles. But that is exactly why creating these loan guarantee programs and having creative financing is so important, because tribes are ready, Indigenous peoples are ready, entrepreneurs are ready. And so creating that access to capital, but also access to creative capital, I think is really important, because when you have Indigenous peoples with solutions, they're not solutions for a day, they're not solutions for a year, they're solutions for generations to come, which requires long-term, consistent capital, which requires a long-term type engagement, right? So building that capital stack in a way that supports those Native and Indigenous visions is so important, and so truly what FNMPC does so well. And I think too, like, looking forward to this conference in terms of really parsing out all of consent, right? And what consent looks like, because if we get to the very bottom of free, prior, and informed consent, it's about equitable participation and equitable decision making in all decisions that impact Indigenous peoples, right? And so how that gets enacted, how that is brought forward through Indigenous leaders changes time over time, but really there's such a creative space when it comes to finance and integrated capital, I think, and opening up those spaces for creative solutions is the way we're going to move forward until we get some of these laws off the books.
So that creativeness, and I think I want to highlight that is at the core of every speaker at the conferences. We bring people on stage who are practically focused on solutions. And I can see what we did last year in bringing the examples I mentioned of the Australians and then our US cousins as well from First Nations and tribes, was to say, look, this is how you have to think to get these things passed. You're right, to work around those legislative barriers, to work around the colonial structures that don't suit Indigenous people and now do not suit the economy overall. As we're going forward, the speakers over and over had pointed out, and it was the theme of our final report, all roads to net zero lead through Indigenous lands. We're going forward into a future where a low carbon, decarbonized future will require Indigenous consent to access the critical minerals, the green energy, the transportation corridors needed to get these things to market. So the creativity, and our conferences are all about that. One of the questions here came about examples of creative financing solutions. Kate has a lot of material at her website at First Peoples Worldwide online. We do as well at FNMPC.ca. If you go under the report section, you'll see reports after reports of how Indigenous people have been creative to fix these solutions, to get around the barriers, to find the capital, to make the deals, to negotiate things that work not only for their economic interests, but their cultural and environmental. One thing that the coalition is laser focused on, is that we service Indigenous people and Indigenous interests, and how those interests can mesh with commercial and environmental solutions is at the core of what we do. So please go to our website, fnmpc.ca, for more information on that. There are other questions that are coming up in here in terms of capacity building. Again, go to our website. The coalition has, as I mentioned, 145 members across Canada right now, all First Nations. And of those nations, they have projects that they wish to see. However, not all nations are completely focused on the economic. Others are very interested on the environmental impact of projects. That question about what skills have to be brought to the table, what questions be asked, how do you integrate Indigenous values into commercial decisions, into environmental planning decisions? It's all online. And our material is Indigenous authored and led and is available for free. So if you go online under the resources tab, it's all there. Please take it, please use it, please share it. So I'm watching the time here. If there's questions, they're coming in fast now, which is great. I'm going to take this one right off. How does Indigenous consent provide Canada with a competitive edge globally? That is the theme of the conference in April next year. What we found in the research going forward at conferences is these and capital markets are starting to require that projects be done in an ESG, environmentally social governance framework approved method. And Indigenous values fit into that. So you're starting to see investors wanting to know, is their money going to do good? What's the impact of it on the ground? Capital sources are starting to request that, investors, pension funds. You're starting to see buyers wanting to know, how was the materials for the product they're going after? Increasingly, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of its People, in particular, free, prior, and informed consent, a key element of that document, consent, is being sought by markets, by allies, by buyers. And Canada, having that already in our legislation, UNDRIP, will provide us an edge over those countries who don't. Buyers will go to those places that are compatible with what their interests are. And that's what we're saying. As Indigenous people, we would make amazing partners to companies looking to access those markets. So that's the answer to that. Again, our conference will be focused specifically on that entire topic. Before I go on here, Jaimie, I want to come back to you. In terms of capital, the changes, interest rates, what's going to come forward in legislation, if it comes forward, if there is going to be something about a federal loan guarantee program. You deal a lot with Indigenous people in the capital market spaces across the country. Do you find that there's rising optimism about what's possible? What do you find that the tone is from Indigenous people across Canada in this space?
Look, I do think there's rising optimism despite rising interest rates. But look, the economy is cyclical, right? We every sort of, you can look at any 10-year period, any 20-year period, any 50-year period for which we've collected economic data, and rates will go up and rates will come down and then they will go up again. We don't want to be too short-sighted in the way that we make economic decisions as Indigenous nations and communities. a good opportunity should be a good opportunity in an up market, in a down market, in a middle market. And so, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. It's not just because interest rates are higher, it doesn't necessarily mean that we shouldn't be entering into projects, that we shouldn't be looking at deals. They just have to be the right deals, and the right deal should be right for an Indigenous community and Indigenous nation in throughout all of those different stages of the economic cycle. And I did too, Mark. It's funny, we have there's always certain points that I think we want to make, but then questions are asked and answers just generate additional thoughts that I'd like to share in response to the question that was asked from the audience around, how it's a competitive advantage for us in Canada, our position on consent, free, prior, and informed consent, and the adoption of UNDRIP. At an even more basic level. And Mark, you're quite right that investors, buyers, companies, they are asking questions about where materials are sourced, about how they're sourced, about the local impacts of sourcing, and consumers are asking. So it is a business bottom line issue. But even at a more basic level than that, it's without consent, without participation from the local community that you're operating in, there's costs involved. There's delay cost, there's legal cost, there's potential reputational cost. So even before we start talking about the end user, the end purchaser of the product, even if the company that you're dealing with isn't altruistic in that sense, wanting to do good, there's just a cost issue on the line if you're not doing good, right?
Kate, anything you want to add to that?
I completely agree, and I think that is more and more true as we move forward. I think there is a statistic out there, something that like of the 30 minerals needed for the green economy, 54% lie underneath Indigenous peoples' lands globally. And I actually think that it's more than that. And so as an economy, as we look for those minerals, there will be more and more interaction with Indigenous peoples. And to the extent that we can elevate consent as not just a sufficient, but a necessary step and a necessary way to engage with Indigenous peoples, I think we will end up exactly as Jaimie is saying. There will be operational delays, there will be material losses, and frankly, there will be human rights impacts. We know that human rights defenders that are Indigenous are killed at a higher rate than others around the world. And so what we can do, I think, when we speak about consent is bring in all of the ways that there is partnership opportunity, all of the ways to screen for risks, all of the ways to forward good engagement and ripe engagement, and understand that there's just no market in the world that will operate without Indigenous impacts. So how can we come together to build Indigenous leadership towards equitable participation, equitable decision making? So just really agree and underscore that I think there's a business case for free, prior, and informed consent. There's a business case to build that in. And then there's also just the fact that if you look at solutions around the world, the people on the land know the land the best. So if we're looking for solutions as it relates to biodiversity and climate and energy solutions, you name it, partnership can elevate those solutions to the benefit of the world around. And good partnership, again, is just a huge part of what FPIC is all about. So I think there's so much to talk about at this next conference in terms of what consent looks like and what the market can, should, and needs to reflect when it comes to FPIC.
So picking up on what the market needs to reflect, 2 conferences ago, the coalition did a conference specifically on ESG standards, and that conference report is online. and you can find it at FNMPC.ca under the Rules and Reports tab. What's interesting when we went through that conference is that we found that there were, at that time, under the main ESG frameworks around the world, and there are many, the main ones, there is no Indigenous in setting this. And why this became an issue to our members is because our members were being approached by proponents saying, don't worry, we have an ESG certification or framework approval on this standard, so your interests are taken care of, but there's nothing in there. That's a risk. It's a material risk to investors, it's a risk to Indigenous people, it's a risk to the companies. And we highlighted that with the highlighted examples in the report online. So please take a look at that. What's interesting is the ESG framework discussion has moved forward. There are new frameworks, new inputs, attempts to update them, and Indigenous people have to be part of them. Otherwise, that risk is still there for all parties. So we will be discussing that at the conference this year. If you want to read up on it from the past conferences, please go to our website. There are a number of questions coming in here, and some of these we've touched on already. The question is, what is the most successful policy initiatives that we have seen to help encourage Indigenous entrepreneurship and involvement in projects? And it is, again, access to capital. It is always the #1 issue. There are issues in capacity. I was
going to say loan guarantee programs, Mark. I feel like a broken record over here.
We like broken records, and we hope that somebody in Ottawa is listening. The loan question is always going to be there. The other question that came up here in terms of capacity for First Nations and Indigenous people to participate, and that can go for everything from the governance questions about how do nations organize themselves in a linear project. No projects, in a major project anyway these days, involve only one First Nation or one tribe. They go across jurisdictions. So how do nations and tribes organize themselves to capture the benefit of a project or to participate in fruitful negotiations? We do address that at the coalition. Again, in our website under the reports section, there are examples of nations who have come together on power stations, on transmission lines, on how nations have organized themselves in a manner that is compatible with their cultural and environmental organizations to match those commercial opportunities. Again, as Kate pointed out, it's bespoke, it's unique, it's each situation having to be defined by our elders and by our councils and by our leaders to say this will work for us. Because in the past, companies deciding that for us has not worked well, and governments working for us have not done well. Outside governments, that is. So I'm going to look through the questions here. There are many here. I don't think we'll be able to get to all of these given the time.
Can I just make a quick reflection, yes, Mark? I was just going to reflect, so much of our work at First Peoples Worldwide is really building that bridge between Indigenous peoples and the private sector. And I was struck by the last report that you put out last year after the conference had a line that said that capital will move where there is support for Indigenous participation. That is what we are signaling to the market, that capital is going to move there. And I think that is only more true today than it was a year ago. And I think, that's what we keep highlighting with the loan guarantee programs, with indigenizing catalytic capital, with all the ways that we can do that. And this idea that there's so many different ways to tackle all of these issues. It's building capacity with tribes and among Indigenous peoples to receive and to harness that capital. It's also working with the private sector to organize and design for Indigenous participation, right? It's asking the private sector, have you figured out how you are going to receive Indigenous participation in decision making? Have you decided how you are going to engage, and from a global perspective, there's more and more Indigenous peoples who have their own FPIC protocols now than ever before. There's to my knowledge, there's over 40 Indigenous nations that have their own protocols. And so the first question to the private sector is, how do you deal with that? What do you do? How do you engage with that protocol? Have you designed for that reality? And I think something I'm really excited about the discussion this year is to talk through that and to have so many Indigenous leaders talk through how they have have worked through engagement, what that looks like, you know, and really talking through. Another thing that I end up saying all the time is free, prior, and informed consent isn't a buffet. You know, you don't get to just get one, the F, the P, or I. You know, it's the whole thing. It's really building in the time for it to be prior, and making sure the engagement is free, and really making sure that the consent is freely given at the end too. And so I'm just so excited for the conversation to be able to parse through all of those different aspects as well.
I'm gonna borrow that, Kate. The that FPIC is not a buffet. I mean, not to be overly lawyerly about it, but it does say free, prior, and informed consent. It's not an or. If it was an or, arguably you could pick just one, right? But it's and. So I love that line, though. I'm gonna borrow it.
So
Sounds
I
good.
think everybody can tell of our hosts at the conference, the discussions that we have. Kate, I'm sorry, I cut you off there, Kate. So these sorts of discussions happen at the conference. So I should point out, yes, 1,500 people, but there's lots of sidebar conversations. What we've heard back in feedback is that companies and tribal and First Nations representatives find value in the discussions that are happening in the hallways and the corridors, because all of a sudden we have people who are very interested in the same topic, who want to see success, environmental success, who want to see business success from a community that is engaged, and as you see our hosts here, wanting to be informed. That's the big question. So again, I'm going to repeat our conference next year, April 22nd, 23rd, 2024 in Toronto, at the Sheraton Centre, will be focused on these exact topics. Because what we're very interested in is practical outcomes that advance Indigenous values in social and environmental decisions that benefit all of us. Again, online, fnmpc.ca/conference for that information. The reason I keep looking up like this at my questions, I have these, my lens questions are up high and they're tiny when they're coming in. Looking at your questions here, some of the questions, working with community understand engagement protocols. So one thing I should point out too, the conference, we've been talking very much about primarily the economic aspect, but the environmental aspect is very important to our members as well. Not all projects are possible. Some will not be compatible with the environmental or cultural interests of a First Nation. And I want to point this out. The coalition is not all nations in Canada as a member, 145. There are over 600 nations in this country. Some nations, this is not for them, and that's fine. We do not impose this value. We're not a pro-business organization that goes into Indigenous communities. We are a pro-Indigenous self-determination organization that backs that self-determination of our members in decisions around environmental and economic participation. So the question here about what people will learn at our conference is not just economic. We will have an entire section here on values-based environmental permitting processes. We will be highlighting examples in Canada and other places, Indigenous, from around the world, and how those nations and communities have put those values in place in commercial agreements. So come and you'll hear about those as well. I do want to point out, as we're going at the end of our time here, is the conference speakers. We have focused very much on getting you the best speakers we can from both Indigenous, private sector, and government to share leading examples. The idea here is that everyone who comes can be able to take that information, make something that works for their communities. If you look at the information that's come out from not only our conference, but First Peoples Worldwide, they challenge industry, they challenge government to think about Indigenous values first, as Kate pointed out, necessary for the future growth of our economy. So we will be having, as I mentioned, the CEO of the Bank of America speaking on the Smart Markets Initiative and how the private sector can be a partner to those communities and nations and people who want to see a better outcome. We will also be having the chair of Rio Tinto will also be, he will be there, Dominic Barton as well. Mark Carney, who has spoken in the past, former governor of the Bank of England, Bank of Canada, current UN envoy on climate change, will also be speaking. And we'll have other speakers that we will announce going forward. We will have a good balance between Indigenous and non-Indigenous. We will also have a very good balance as much as possible between Canada and the United States in terms of tribal and First Nations leaders. The whole purpose of the conference is to learn. So if you have questions, and some of them are here about other examples of capacity building or examples of how communities have raised capital, again, go to the websites, both of First Peoples Worldwide and First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and you'll see the case studies that we've published. You'll also see information on how capital markets work, how electric transmission distribution systems work and make money. Examples how Indigenous people around the world have used creative means to get to a point that matches their values in their engagement with the private sector. So I'm going to give final comments here to my co-host before we go. Kate, do you have any final comments? Anything you want to share before we end this discussion this morning?
Just to say that I love that point you just made, that Indigenous nations have worked so hard to get to a point where their values are front and center in a term sheet and front and center in their economic engagements. And so I'm just excited to continue this conversation to talk about how consent really is the way to elevate all of the priorities of Indigenous leaders, whether it's economic, environmental, cultural, social, and even spiritual and ancestral ties to the land that get elevated. So I'm so excited to really see that front and center, and to signal to the market that not only is there Indigenous participation, but to expect substantive participation in order to move forward in our economy. So looking forward to it.
Jaimie.
Well, that makes two of us, Kate. I'm very much looking forward to the discussion in Toronto in April of next year. And I'm just so proud to be part of the advancement of these discussions, right, Mark? I've had the great pleasure of being at many of the FNMPC annual general events, and the conversation just flows so nicely from one topic to the next. You start with a discussion around values and how do we incorporate values into an economy that makes sense for Indigenous participation. And next year we're going to talk about consent. And to me, that's the natural next step in the discussion. And I think it's so important that we're having these discussions, that we're bringing together players from Indigenous leadership, from Indigenous community, from project proponents, the finance folks in the country, government officials. Those are the people that need to be at the table for us to continue to make progress on these issues. And I'm so looking forward to being part of the discussion.
Well, thank you. The Coalition has been honored to have each of you as a co-host of our conferences, and we look forward to hosting you and our viewers at the next conference, which I'm going to repeat, April 22nd, 23rd, 2024 in Toronto. If you go to the website fnmpc.ca/conference, you'll find information. You'll find information on that website as well from the past conferences. We do put out a pre-read report before the conference just to bring everybody up to speed so the discussions can be fruitful when the conference happens. And we put out a very thorough after report, which you'll find online from the past conferences. So I want to thank both my co-hosts for being here today, and I want to thank you all for joining. And we look forward to seeing you in April next year in Toronto. So thank you. Have a good day.
Thanks, Mark. Good to see you, Kate.
Good to see you. Thanks, everyone.